So why are we drawn to these stories? Why does Ed Gein's psychology still fascinate? Not because we're morbid, not because we celebrate darkness, but because we recognize something uncomfortable, something true, the fragility of the boundaries we depend on. When you watch Psycho, you don't just see Norman Bates as a monster, you see him as human, sympathetic even, until the fracture reveals itself. And that moment, that recognition that someone so ordinary could become something so broken, that's what haunts you, because it suggests those boundaries aren't as solid as we pretend, that under the wrong circumstances with enough isolation and damage, any mind could fracture. This is the mirror effect. These stories reflect our fears back to us, not about external threats, about internal fragility, about what happens when the structures that keep us sane, connection boundaries, social reinforcement, disappear. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who conducted the Stanford prison experiment, talked about the Lucifer effect, how ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil under certain conditions, not because they're inherently bad, but because situations can override individual morality, authority, social pressure, dehumanization, isolation, anonymity. Remove normal social constraints and behavior changes dramatically. Ed Gein's situation was similar but more extreme, not a temporary experiment, a lifetime, complete isolation, total control, then total absence of structure. The miracle isn't that his mind fractured, it's that any mind wouldn't. Neuroscientist James Fallon studied psychopathic brains, including his own. He discovered he had many of the brain markers associated with psychopathy: low empathy, reduced emotional response. But he wasn't a criminal. Why? Social connection, a loving family, community ties. The neurology predisposed him, but environment determined outcome. This is the insight we keep rediscovering. Biology isn't destiny. Environment matters. Connection matters. Ed Gein likely had no predisposition to violence, no genetic markers, no neurological abnormalities, just isolation, just repression, just the complete absence of healthy human development. And that was enough. This is what makes these stories powerful. They're not about the monster out there. They're about the monster that could emerge in here, in any of us, under the wrong conditions. That's not fatalistic. It's empowering, because if darkness is created rather than innate, it can be prevented. Through connection, through intervention, through refusing to let isolation become pathological, through recognizing when someone's social world is shrinking, when loneliness becomes dangerous, when mental health deteriorates without support. These stories teach us to look, to notice, to care before it's too late. Not just for their sake, for everyone's. Because isolated people don't just suffer alone. Their fracture creates ripples, harm, tragedy that extends far beyond their individual pain. This is why studying darkness matters. Not to glorify it, to understand it, to see where the boundaries are by observing what happens when they're gone, to recognize the signs of deterioration before fracture becomes irreversible. To value connection not just as comfort but as necessity, as the thing that keeps us human. Modern psychology has embraced this. Loneliness is now recognized as a public health crisis, not just because it makes people sad, because it makes them sick. Mentally, physically, socially. Social isolation increases risk of dementia, heart disease, stroke, depression, anxiety, suicide. And in extreme cases, in cases like Ed Gein, it creates something worse than illness. It creates absence. The absence of the development that makes morality, empathy, and humanity possible. So when we study these cases, we're not indulging in morbid curiosity. We're learning survival skills, social survival skills. How to recognize isolation in ourselves and others. How to maintain connection even when it's difficult. How to intervene before loneliness becomes pathology. How to build communities that don't let people fall through the cracks. Because Ed Gein's story isn't ancient history. It's a warning that remains relevant, that isolation is always dangerous, that connection is always necessary, that the boundaries keeping us human require constant maintenance, through relationships, through community, through refusing to let anyone become so alone that they lose touch with shared reality. That's the lesson. That's why we keep telling these stories, not to scare ourselves, to remind ourselves of what we need, of what we risk losing, of why connection isn't optional. It's the foundation of everything that makes us human. We've journeyed through darkness, not for its own sake, but to understand something essential. Ed Gein's story isn't about one man. It's about the human condition, about what happens when the structures we depend on, family, community, connection, boundaries, collapse completely. His mind didn't fracture because he was born broken. It fractured because he lived an entire life in isolation, controlled by one relationship, then abandoned to none, never allowed to develop normally, never given the social feedback that creates empathy, boundaries, identity. And when that feedback disappeared entirely, so did his ability to navigate reality. This could have been prevented. Not easily, not obviously, but it could have been. If rural mental health resources existed in 1940s Wisconsin, if community members recognized pathological isolation and intervened, if there had been any therapeutic support, any social safety net, any recognition that this level of loneliness was dangerous. But there wasn't, and a mind broke, and the consequences echoed through decades, not just in what happened, in what it revealed about human vulnerability, about how fragile our sanity is, how dependent on constant social reinforcement, about what we risk when we allow anyone to become completely alone.